Women and men who do the same job, the women end up getting paid less?
Yes.
And you control for everything else? No, sorry, the data is wrong. There's at least 16 reasons why men get paid more than women. Men work longer hours. If you work 10% longer hours, you make 40% more money. Okay, men work in more dangerous positions. So there's a wage advantage for working in more dangerous positions. Men are more likely to move as a consequence of being required to by their job. They're more likely to work in STEM fields. They're more likely to work in fields where you can scale. You can't just say, well, it's a consequence of gender discrimination, unless you can only think about one thing at a time. And I would say that's another problem with the modern feminists, is they can only think about one thing at a time. The notion that there's such a thing as gender, that's not right. There's variability in personality and temperament. And the idea that, that there's no such thing as biological sex, that's just insane. If there's no such thing as sex, it's like, well, what, then just act out your role. Right. Leave your body alone because it's irrelevant anyways. Well, it turns out it's not irrelevant. You have to go through the surgical transformation, which is a pretty dramatic answer to a question that for 99% of people who are ambivalent about their gender identity would be best solved without surgical intervention. Yep. And then so now, in Canada, because they banned conversion therapy, it's now all affirmation therapy. Right, there's no such thing as affirmation therapy. There isn't a goddamn thing that can be done to me to make me allow the government to compel my speech. That's not happening. And the reason for that, I believe the reason for that, is because I spent decades studying totalitarianism. It's not good. And the way that totalitarian states develop is that people give up their right to be, to exist with their own thoughts. They lie. The individuals sacrifice their own souls to the dictates of the state. And then everything goes badly sideways. Well, how much evidence for that do we need? The lies and tyranny of the state are aided and abetted by the moral sacrifice of the individual. It's not top down. The Nazis are telling you what to do and you're all innocent and obeying. That's not how it works. You falsify your being bit by bit and you end up where you don't want to be. And that's a bad idea.
I want to know, what is your answer to young people for some of the really big problems facing humanity, like the climate catastrophe, like economic crisis, like the precarious job market? Because they just don't, like, you talk all this much about individual responsibility. Most of us are never going to be able to afford to have all of these assets to have responsibility over. So what is your advice beyond banal comments like clean your room?
Well, it's actually rather difficult to answer a question that ends with your comments are banal, politely. So, I would consider that more of an opinionated, personal and political statement than actually a question. So why don't you try reformulating that so that there's an actual question there?
What is your
Neuralink, delving into the depths of the mind.
And Starlink, it's like, go Elon, as far as I'm concerned. And then, he puts his finger on things so oddly. The problem is underpopulation. It's like, I think so too. I think it's a terrible problem that the West, for example, is no longer at replacement with regard to birth rate. It means we've abandoned the virgin and the child in the most fundamental sense. It's a bloody catastrophe. And Musk, he sees it clear as can be. It's like, wow. And where everyone else is running around going, oh, there's too many people. It's like, nope. Got that. Not only, see, I've learned that there are falsehoods and lies, and there are anti-truths. And an anti-truth is something that's so preposterous that you couldn't make a claim that's more opposite to the truth. And the claim that there are too many people on the planet is an anti-truth. The narcissist passes him or herself off as a competent and confident person. And one way of elevating your reputation is to claim unearned moral virtue. And so a huge part of what motivates the woke nonsense that insists that the mere reflexive act of feeling sorry for someone constitutes a moral virtue is an attempt to claim a reputational status without having to do any of the work whatsoever to be a genuinely good person. To be a good person, you have to be productive. That's hard. And you have to be generous. And that's hard. And you have to play medium to long-term, stable, voluntary games with other people. And that's hard. That's nothing but diligent, upward-oriented work over years puts you in that position. Whereas if you make a unwarranted moral claim, I'm compassionate, let's say, then instantly you're with the angels. And it also allows you to derogate those who you regard as predatory, let's say, and also enhance your moral virtue. Not only am I compassionate, and that makes me good, but and I'm on the side of the angels, but there are the snakes, and they're not in me at all, because I'm saintly in all regards. And so the snakes have to be somewhere. We all suffer from the problem of where to put Satan, that's for sure. And the most convenient place to put him is in someone else. And it's even more convenient if that redounds to your benefit and plays to your political aspirations.
I just want people to be aware that trans and gender diverse communities, and especially people of color, are being targeted and threatened physically. So free speech is a great idea, and equality is a great idea, but we actually can't have those conversations when people are not even able to be present.
If they find me, I won't pay it. If they put me in jail, I'll go on a hunger strike. I'm not doing this. And that's that. I'm not using the words that other people require me to use, especially if they're made up by radical left-wing ideologues. Now, if our society comes to some sort of consensus over the next while about how we'll solve the pronoun problem, let's call it, and that becomes part of popular parlance, and it seems to solve the problem properly without sacrificing the distinction between singular and plural, and without requiring me to memorize an impossible list of an indefinite number of pronouns, then I would be willing to reconsider my position. But I'm also partly opposed to this because it's been made mandatory and has the whole weight of the law behind it. It's like, this is a very bad idea. I believe this is a very bad idea. And I believe that the reason this has caused so much noise, tremendous amount of noise, tremendous amount of attention on YouTube, is because there are things that are at stake in this discussion, despite its surface nature, that strike at the very heart of our civilization. That's what I believe. If you gaze into the abyss long enough, you see the light, not the darkness.
Are you sure about that?
I'm betting my life on it.
Yeah, that's a heck of a bet.
Well, that's...
Because it might distort your mind to where all you see...
is abyss.
Is abyss. Yeah. Is the evil in this world.
Well, then I would say you haven't looked long enough. You know, that's back to the...
You're just a limited...
the swords, the flaming swords. It's like... So I said the whole story of Christ was prefigured in that image. It's like the story of Christ, psychologically, is radical acceptance of the worst possible tragedy. That's what it means. That's what the crucifix means. Psychologically, it's like gaze upon that which you are most afraid of. But that story doesn't end there, because in the story, Christ goes through death into hell. So death isn't enough. The abyss of innocent death is not sufficient to produce redemption. It has to be a voluntary journey to hell. And maybe that's true for everyone. And that's like, there is no more terrifying idea than that.
The idea that liberals, especially intellectuals, are preoccupied with politically correct speech, that they're not...
Oh, I see.
And yet...
No, they're too preoccupied with identity politics by a large margin. And they tend to categorize everyone by their ethnicity and their sex and their gender. And I think all that does is turn people into tribal actors, and that the end result of that is catastrophe.
But weren't you also saying, though, that the left is too worried about offending people?
I think that goes along with...
I will.
Yes. Right. Female violent aggression doesn't work very well.
No.
First of all, girls tend not to fight physically with one another, and certainly girls can't fight. Girls can fight with boys because there's not much difference between girls and boys, say, before puberty in terms of physical strength. But once puberty hits, women can't compete in the physical aggression domain. Mm-hmm. And they're not inclined to either, because they could use guns and knives, but they tend not to. But women have their own underground means of stealing, and they steal reputation, and they're very good at it. And it's very many women and many other men as well who use this pattern of derogation and reputation enhancement.
And is this a scientific fact?
Yes, absolutely. This is a well-developed psychiatric literature stemming back decades.
Right.
You know, I've talked about this publicly several times, and the journalists I talk to are always stunned that how could I possibly propose such a thing? It's like, well, there's a 50-year literature on it. Just because you don't know it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Yeah. And it's reputation savaging and derogation. Mean girls, you can't play with us. You can't sit with us. No, and that's simultaneously a self-elevation and also a derogation of the other. It's very effective and very pernicious and extremely difficult to control. Like, what do you do about it? If you're a girl and you're isolated and shamed in that way, what can you do? You can't really use recourse to authority, because if you go tell a teacher, let's say you're being picked on in junior high, then you're just laughed at because you can't handle your own battles, and you can't bring it to a physical, to the point of physical altercation. You can if you're a man, and that happens very rapidly with men, which is why it almost never happens. It happens almost immediately with men. It's like, what did you say? Do you want to say that again? And any man worth his salt knows how to play that game. And so generally among men, this just doesn't happen.
If you agree that adults can decide to transition, then why would the physician be criminal? Don't adults have that right if they want to transition?
Not everything legal isn't criminal. And do they have that right? See, I would have left Ellen Page alone if she hadn't been parading her new abs in a fashion magazine. How many kids do you think she can convince to convert? 1?
Yeah.
1,000? No, not,
See,
yeah.
No,
really.
I want to...
One of the reasons that I opposed Bill C-16 in Canada to begin with, this pronoun-compelled speech bill, was because I knew perfectly well what was going to happen when we introduced confusion about gender identity into the public sphere. Now, the argument was that if we left people with gender dysphoria alone to make their own way and stop torturing them, that we would decrease the mental health load on those individuals. And my analysis as a clinician was that for every one person of that sort that we hypothetically save, we doom 1,000 more as a consequence of confusion and social contagion.